I told her about that. Matt, who like told her about the girl passing the blood.
Oh yeah.
She found it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't, nobody else pays our
Yeah.
I heard the five.
don't pay. Dude, I like daycare. That's been something last semester. That semester, she was basically cheating. I'm like what every other section.
Oh, his quote is ambiguous and obvious.
Excellent.
Like the plain meaning is perfect.
Hate to quit like right.
The beginning is so sad.
It's on that.
I just talked about this.
It's really nice. So now it's fun.
Like start the application process.
See, I wish it was like
Private.
together. It's just like you have 2 hours.
For Illinois, you said
Our doctor. Getting contracts on the way. No, like getting contracts on the way.
When you begin, John?
Oh, that is Gene part.
also Cipro should always be there.
Oh, I think it is. It is. I think it is. Yeah. Almost always second.
Good afternoon. We're going to start today on the concept of the American prophets, which are major figures who, in the antebellum period, articulated a vision of American democracy. And so we'll discuss both their vision of democracy and the understanding of prophets, and we'll discuss Tocqueville, Frederick Douglass, Lincoln, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and we'll probably bring in some Whitman and Emerson who were also seen as prophets in their time. Do you want to add anything to that introduction? So I'd like to begin with Tocqueville. All of you are no doubt familiar with Tocqueville. Many of you probably read Tocqueville. He traveled when he was in the United States with Gustave Beaumont. What's significant to know is that Beaumont was far more aware of some of the seamier sides of the United States than was Tocqueville, particularly the blight of slavery. Beaumont also wrote a history of his travels in America. They traveled together, and for Beaumont, slavery was a centrality of American life, both in the North and especially in the South, and of what was then called Indian removal. It's also important to understand the context of Tocqueville's travels, which is early 1830s. And it coincides with a near secession. John C. Calhoun, in his quest to repudiate tariffs, he called it the abomination of tariffs, defended nullification, meaning that a single state's right to nullify federal law whenever they wanted to do so, which is essentially, politically, a form of secession. Calhoun said that a state's right to nullify federal law flowed from a higher source than the Constitution. He called it God's law. Calhoun also declared that the state right, veto, nullification, or any other name is the fundamental principle of our system. So he essentially wanted to explode the Constitution that saw the United States as a nation and give the greatest power to individual states. In fact, after Calhoun's speech on nullification, John Quincy Adams, who in my view was one of the greatest political intellectuals of the era, called Calhoun's speech the beginning of organized civil war. This was also an era that was the rise of the American Colonization Society, which was an effort for liberal whites, both in the North and in the South, to colonize organize, essentially, it was a form of ethnic cleansing to encourage free blacks, only free blacks, to leave the United States. They took over an area which later became Liberia, and American Colonization Society was a major organization. It was a nonprofit, so to speak, a voluntary society, which is what the name was. And African Americans hated the American Colonization Society because they saw it as a form of ethnic cleansing. And ultimately, between 1820s and 1861, the vast majority of African Americans who went to Liberia were slaves in the Upper South whose masters felt guilty and said, "I will free you, but only if you go to Liberia." Which, what kind of option or what kind of choice is that? So it also, that very anecdote highlights the depth and the structures of racism in the United States. There were also the early 1830s when Tocqueville and Beaumont were traveling. It was also in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, which had completely transformed the United States. And it's at this time when Northerners, especially Northern black and white abolitionists, recognized that the South had become a closed society, meaning suppressing civil liberties and all freedoms of speech, petition, debate, assembly, on any criticism of slavery. And that reflected, in a sense, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, which was almost successful, in which Turner and a group of ultimately 100 slaves took over a county, and the rebellion was eventually destroyed, and Turner gave an as-told-to confession to a lawyer, and so it's the only account of a slave rebel explaining the reason for the rebellion, and he just excoriates the South and the institution of slavery, in which slave owners and Southerners saw it as a comparatively benevolent institution. So the larger point is that beginning in the early 1830s, white Southerners became very self-conscious at disseminating this message that slavery was a benevolent institution. It was a good thing for masters, for slaves, for all societies. That a slave society was a far better form of politics, culture than was a free society. In many respects, in fact, there's one of my former graduate students coming out with a 2-volume book on this understanding the slave South in the United States in the antebellum period as a feudal society. Most scholars have repudiated the notion of feudalism, which is rigorously hierarchical and anti-democratic. And in the South, that was really what it was. It was defined in terms of white and black, and rich and poor, and men and women. In Tocqueville, he celebrated, his focus was white or European man, which he called preeminent, and below him was what he called the Negro and the Indian. He said the Indian was destined to die out. He, in one sense, sympathized with slavery by saying that enslaved people who become free, face a heavier burden than they were as slaves, which is not exactly sympathetic. But he also did say that free blacks sink to such a depth of wretchedness that while servitude brutalizes him, liberty destroys him. So that's, Tocqueville has this very rigorous hierarchy that has been celebrated throughout the 20th century, less so today. Tocqueville's vision of democracy focused on white men. It focused on equality more than freedom, as the quotes that I offered suggest. and Tocqueville celebrated, in fact, he coined the concept of individualism, which was this form of freedom in which individuals were, that it would encourage an individual to pursue anything that he wanted to as a man, and that it should not be beholden to other people. He was critical of the vanity of individualism, so he coupled that with what he called voluntary societies. That individualism would lead to a kind of anarchy, or could lead to a kind of an anarchic structure, and voluntary societies, whether it's churches or Tocqueville, American Colonization Society, essentially what we would now call nonprofits that bring people together from different communities, was an antidote to individualism, Tocqueville saw that as a criticism that American men saw themselves as isolados, and from the perspective of a nation state, that was not a good thing. Douglass, in his great speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," exposes the hypocrisy of America, of the United States. When he gives this speech, he was already nationally famous. He was already one of the most famous men or women in the United States. For those of you who don't know, he was born in Maryland and on the Eastern Shore in 1818, escapes from slavery in 1838, becomes a leading abolitionist orator with the William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. Goes to Europe, and Europe was a huge influence on Douglass because he flees for Europe because he publishes his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He publishes that because he was increasingly accused on the lecture circuit for abolitionism of being a fraud. He was so eloquent, he was so articulate, he came across as such a great intellectual that increasingly audiences accused him of being a fraud, saying there's no way you could have been a slave. You must have been raised a free black, you must have had formal education. And the worst accusation against an abolition orator is the one of being a false, of not being a slave. So that leads him to publish his narrative, where he, unlike most slave narratives, he names names. He names exactly who his owners or where he was. And at the time he was a fugitive, his two owners, Hugh Auld and Thomas Auld, were both his owners, and Hugh Auld published an editorial in the Baltimore newspaper after reading Douglass's narrative, saying that he will go to any length possible to recapture his property. And the American Anti-Slavery Society recognized that Douglass was in huge danger, and they sent him to England, Ireland, and Scotland. And Douglass said that when he was there, it was the first time in his life where he experienced an utter dearth of racism. That he could walk down the streets for the first time and not have someone spit in his face or mumble the N-word to him. And he said the only reason that he returned to the United States after living in England, Ireland, and Scotland and becoming famous there because of his oratory was owing to his sense of obligation and responsibility to fellow African Americans. So he returns, he becomes a political abolitionist, wants to use the Constitution, interpret the Constitution as anti-slavery so that it conforms with the Declaration. He moves his family to Rochester, New York, which at that time was a major journalist hub and also a hotbed of political abolitionism. Political abolitionists interpreted the Constitution as slavery and did some close readings to develop that interpretation, and felt that they could be more effective as in political circles than William Lloyd Garrison's Non-Resistance Society, which are the two major abolitionist organizations. And Garrison Society was, the non-resistance was essentially non-voting, that the United States was corrupt politically, and to embrace a kind of intellectual and emotional independence from the politics of the country, and to use one's voice to try to convert Americans. So Douglass returns, and he's in Rochester. Was invited to give the 4th of July oration. It was one of the most prestigious appointments that one could have. 4th of July orations at this time. It was a holiday. It was orations were attended by almost the entire city. He gave the oration at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York, and it's a Jeremiah. Is the easiest way to summarize it. And what's a Jeremiah? That comes from the Puritans. It's a song or speech or story of lament, highlighting the declension of society, of a nation, of the church. And the function of the Jeremiah is to inspire and to rally the audience, to recognize the declension, and to seek to restore the formal vision that society had, or in a religious sense, the church had. So he begins his speech by putting his audience at ease, by saying, you have good reason to be proud of this state. You have good reason to celebrate the founders. And so he makes them feel comfortable. He wants to bring his audience to him. And then there's a sharp break. And the sharp break is 80% of the speech after he has the attention of his audience. And his audience was majority white, but also some African American. He says, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? A day that reveals to him the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings are mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of the practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. And in that sense, he was accurate, because by 1850, the United States was the largest slave nation in the world. More slaves in the United States than anywhere else in the world, any other single country in the world. He ends the paragraph, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, American reigns without rival. And he goes on to cast the dramatic divide between the North and the South, and Douglass himself kind of articulates this vision of racial feudalism in the South. And that racism occurs in the North, but the South is truly a kind of medieval feudalistic society. He condemns the cultural structures of the nation, from the internal slave trade and the idea of religious liberties. Most of the mainstream churches accepted or embraced religion. At the Civil War, northern and southern churches ended up splitting, and in 1850 some of them did. But the mainstream churches, as a way to avoid secession, essentially, within the churches, northern churches capitulated to southern churches, among the major churches. The internal slave trade, religious liberties churches, two-party system were all complicit and part of this slave nation. And then after this, essentially, it's a 2-hour speech, about an hour and a half, Douglass ends where he begins. He says, I end where I began, with hope. But his hope depends upon the intervention of God. In fact, he invokes God. Douglass was literally a religious prophet. Douglass believed that he knew God's will and was acting on. And it's one of the characteristics of the leading American prophets, whether it's Douglass or Emerson or Whitman. A central aspect is the power of faith. Not so much the nature of it, but the will, as William James would later say, the will to believe in God or Christ or whomever is immensely empowering, regardless of whether or not God exists. And James rightly noted that, scientifically there's no way to know whether or not God exists. All we ultimately have is belief itself. But the power of belief itself to an individual and to society is absolutely extraordinary. One of the greatest powers an individual has, and arguably the nation. Another group of prophets were women's rights activists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton in particular. Virtually every women's rights activist, both men and women, were also abolitionists. And almost all abolitionists were women's rights activists. So they recognized the profound limitations of the idea of equality. Equality for all under the law, which Charles Sumner would later enshrine in the law. In the Declaration of Sentiments, they created a number of resolutions to urge men, primarily, to urge Americans in general. It was circulated widely to recognize women as equal, and to advocate this equal rights, the same votes. And in fact, Douglass, there were a number of people at the Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass was one, who worried that a resolution, it was the first major women's rights congregation in history, and a number of participants, men and women, felt that a resolution advocating or demanding equal suffrage for men and women would be seen as too revolutionary, too radical. Douglass gave a brief speech to convince the group, and it passed. And they articulate a number of, their central theme is, as one resolution begins, the woman is man's equal. Was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such. Both abolitionists, black and white, and women's rights activists, these prophets, so to speak, were themselves, from a religious sense, prophets. In their reading of Scripture, they dispensed with what the church told you how to interpret Scripture and engaged in it themselves. And a central theme that they latched onto, which is everywhere in the New Testament and in parts of the Hebrew Bible, and that is the theme of freedom and equality. That's what they latched onto. The sacred book that was, and Americans even then were far more religious than European nations. And the religious influence in the United States, virtually every religious historian will say this, stemmed in part, ironically, because of the separation of church and state in the Constitution. And the separation of church and state required ministers and churches to compete in a marketplace, especially in a capitalist marketplace, and to change the liturgy, to change the message, to change the structure and culture of the church according to society's changes. And in which, actually, you go to Europe today, and a number of churches in Europe, they're still giving, the liturgy is still the same as it was 100 years ago. There are very few, even the Catholic Church has changed. So that, ironically, the fact that a church has to compete with other businesses became a boon, a huge boon for religious, the power of religion that continues to exist in the United States today. It's not the only one, but it's profoundly central. Then I'll just, I want to briefly summarize Lincoln as a prophet. It's why we assigned the address before the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society. Lincoln believes in artisan. He loves the idea of artisans. Now, a lot of scholars, and I should say that it was the historiography of the United States was kind of developed in the late 19th, especially the early 20th century, from roughly 1900 to 1990. White Southerners had control, or gained control of the history and story of the United States. And so in the basic textbooks through the 1980s, slavery was a comparatively benign institution. Blacks were completely erased from the story, other than as groups. The idea that abolitionists were black, the very first, honestly, my first book was the first book to emphasize the interracial nature of the abolition movement. Before that, abolitionists were seen solely as whites, whereas we African Americans were the first abolitionists. But in any event, the Mudsill theory is a theory of artisanship. And I mentioned the historiography because throughout most of the 20th century, historians, the standard synthesis was the North had become this capitalist society, not artisanal, but a corporation where they exploited white workers more profoundly than enslaved people were exploited in the South. And they drew heavily on people like George Fitzhugh, who said the Southern slave is far better off than the Northern worker, because the Northern worker is exploited, works long hours, paid meagerly, is scrounging for his food and drink and his shelter. Our enslaved people, they don't have to worry about being well fed and well cared for and well sheltered. So it was part of the South's vision that continued in many respects in the historiography of the 20th century to see the South as the better society, because there is a natural hierarchy, and everyone needs to know one's place in that hierarchy. Lincoln explodes that with his Mudsill theory. He believes, as he says, that everyone, every man and woman, should have the opportunity to acquire a skill or a craft, and to, what Lincoln said over and over again, to receive the fruits of one's own labor. That's an artisanal vision, not a corporate capitalist vision, which scholars have imposed on, fictionalized onto the North. The vast majority of Northerners in the free states were truly artisans. Most of them were farmers. The family and the larger family structure, some grandparents were often involved, cousins, etc., they ran a family farm. There are also small shops. It's why the internal improvements, roads, canals, infrastructure, transformed the northern states. The South was a
feudal society. White Southerners in virtually every southern states refused federal money to create roads, canals, and infrastructure. Why? Because roads, canals, infrastructure made it easier for enslaved people to escape. There was you walked in, and Northerners would say this. You walked into this, there's no hotels, there's no restaurants. It's all private property. Or large swaths of land, no improvements, and the center of Southern life, the main power broker, the most powerful individual, was the master of a plantation. And there was a rigorous hierarchy. And within that rigorous hierarchy, the majority of white Southerners were non-slave owners, but they embraced the vision of the American dream. If they worked hard, and if they were on a plantation that had 200 or 300 or 500 slaves, maybe the owner of the plantation or the overseer might give this overseer a Christmas present as an enslaved person. Frederick Douglass describes that in his second autobiography. Edward Covey, who becomes the great villain of American culture because of Douglass's portrayal of it. Covey was a slave breaker. He forced slaves to cultivate wheat primarily. It was very common to hire out slaves for a year. So even it encouraged masters to own more and more slaves, because even if you didn't have work for them in your plantation, they were chattel. You could lease them out for a year and make good money for that year. That's what Douglass's master, Thomas Hall, did to Douglass. He leased them out to Covey, who's the slave breaker. And Douglass noted that Covey owned at that time one enslaved person who was a young 20-year-old or 18-teenager woman. He required, and Douglass spells this out in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he required her to sleep in this tiny little shack, and Covey selected a male enslaved person to sleep with her. And after the year that Douglass is employed with Covey owns two slaves. The one slave who was a woman, got pregnant, and she now owned two slaves. This is in the 1830s. By the Civil War, Covey was a very wealthy planter. He owned like 15 slaves through what Douglass would refer to as breeding and radical exploitation of the labor system. In any event, to go back to Lincoln's mudsill theory, Lincoln believes in this artisanal system, and he contrasts continually the artisanal vision with the hired laborers or slaves. In fact, Lincoln says they further assume that whoever is once a hired laborer is fatally fixed in that condition for life, and then thence again that his condition is as bad or as worse than that of a slave. This is the mudsill. So he's critiquing what white Southerners are arguing about the North. James Henry Hammond, in his famous speech in the Senate, articulates for the nation this mudsill theory. And I can read, I'll read just parts of it to you. Hold on a second. In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties to perform the drudgery of life. And that's representative of Southern elites. There is a rigorous hierarchy. To tamper with that is to create chaos in a nation state, in a society. That is a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads to progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand. A race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. This natural hierarchy is the vision of the good society. We use them for our purpose. We call them slaves. We found them slaves by the common consent of mankind. And then he quotes Cicero. The highest word of proof is what nature is nature's law. We are old-fashioned, and they've embraced themselves old. They looked to medieval Europe. They looked to slave Greece and slave society in Rome as their vision of the good society. And Lincoln is countering that with everyone is free in this artisanal society in which everyone receives the fruits of their own labor, including African Americans and including women.
Good. So, I think first we should ask whether there are any comments or questions about the remarks that John made now, because I intend to take a somewhat different direction. So, I intend to speak now to the American prophets, the message of the American prophets, focusing on the idea of this individual, not the slaves, not the Indians, not the women, but the free man who is in this condition of mastery. And what is the idea about him? Because that, after all, is the highest level of the system. And so who were these American prophets? They were Lincoln, Emerson, Whitman. We could add maybe Melville to this list.
I would also add, as I said, Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass.
David White's brilliant book, Frederick Douglass, American Prophet.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I would add. Certainly Lincoln, I would add.
So my intention is first to describe their message, controversially. I'm going to present a contested view, and then to criticize their message, because the easy position to take with respect to the American prophets is that the problem lies only in the failure to enact their message. And the premise now of my account is that that's not good enough. The problem is not just the distance between what they proposed and reality. The problem lies as well in the message itself. So the first step of my account is the essence of their message. The second is the criticism of the message. And the third then, if there's time, is a thought experiment to imagine what direction in the transformation of the country would give practical substance to this criticism to the prophetic message as revised by the criticism that I will describe. So the message is the message that the individual, this individual self-fashioning agent, participates in the inner life of God. It's not just that he is in contact with God, in correspondence with God. In a very real sense, he also is God. And what he shares especially is the divine attribute of transcendence. Not omnipotence, not omniscience, but transcendence. he has in him always more than there is in the structures of social life that surround him.
So can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Is that transcendence inner or outer? In other words, take an example of Douglas. Does he believe in internal transcendence, or is he primarily focused on external transcendence?
What do you mean by this contrast between internal and external?
The internal transcendence is that seeing oneself as a God figure oneself, seeing oneself as a kind of God.
Yes, but that has to be then manifest. It has to have an external manifestation in the organization of society and culture.
Right.
So the individual is in direct contact with God. In the most extreme theological versions of this idea,
Right.
the individual is uncreated. The self existed from the beginning in contact with God, an isolated, self-subsistent God in communion with an isolated, self-subsistent individual. Remember from last week when we began the distinction between three religious tendencies in the United States. So the organized forms of Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, and so forth. The secular humanism, which is to a large extent a secularization of the Christian beliefs. And this third element that Harold Bloom calls the American religion, represented by the churches that the Americans created. Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Latter-day Saints, and so forth. The distinctive element in that third tendency is this idea that the individual is himself participant in this inner life of God. And he has this quality of self-subsistence. He is the origin of the divine because he is God. He is a piece of God. That's the central idea, and we see that idea.
Probably best manifested in Quakers who believe explicitly that the inner light of God or Christ is within me and within you and with all humans.
The spirit which speaks through the individual, yes. But also in Emerson, clearly,
as I said
and
before,
indeed in Whitman, in a democratic.
and both Emerson and Whitman said, as I mentioned to you beforehand, before class, Emerson and Whitman both said that they did not identify and that were not members of any religious organization. If they had to choose, they would both be Quakers. And the Quaker vision of the inner light of God or Christ is within you and within me and within all humans was hugely inspirational for Emerson, Whitman, and many others.
So there is this transcendent absolute God in communion with a transcendent absolute individual who is in some sense an emanation, not just a creature of God. And then the question is, what will be the expression of this in social life? But this is this idea that the individual is not just commanded by God, but he is, as it were, a version of God.
That's where I don't see Douglas or Emerson or Whitman.
All of them, because
I don't see them as seeing themselves as a version of God, that they're inspired by God, that God is within them. There's a question we should take. Go ahead.
Yes, clarifying question. So does this exist in tandem or with the teachings of other theologies, as you mentioned, Catholicism, Protestantism? So like the idea of the self having this intimate relationship with God is also existing with the teachings you get from your religious upbringing, like Catholicism, where it's like you teach
well,
these services.
I think we have to distinguish between the doctrinal organized form of this idea in this American religion, this third tendency, And the larger expression of it in people like Whitman or Lincoln or Emerson, for that matter, who were not sectarians themselves. But they nevertheless, I think, gave this American tilt to the idea. And the idea is that the individual is an autonomous source of the divinization of the world. That is, God acts also through the individual, who is, in some sense, divine. The individual shares in this divine attribute of transcendence and becomes himself, through his action in the world, a source of sanctification. So that's what I'm calling this tilt to the idea that is compatible with allegiance to many different theological positions.
Although Catholicism, it's much harder to, it was very rare for Catholics, at least in the 19th century, to embrace that kind of vision because of the rigid hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church.
But nothing in the nature of Christianity excluded this position, because
That's
this was
correct.
really your question
Right.
of whether this was incompatible. Because now, if we step back for a moment from this discussion to an account of the inner content of Christianity, I would say that the two central ideas in Christianity are first the idea of the infinite, expressed in God and in the individual incarnate spirit, transcendence, and the idea of love as the organizing principle of the moral life. Love, not altruism, because love is not the same thing as altruism. Altruism is a gift from a distance, from on high, to the individual below. And altruism requires sacrifice, but it doesn't require imagination. For love, the threshold is the ability to imagine the other. And then this reciprocal engagement on the plane of equality. And finally, altruism, even though it may require sacrifice, even though the sacrifice of one's own life imposes no inner jeopardy. Whereas in love, there is a possibility of rejection, of rebuff. And there is a heightening of vulnerability. Love is fundamentally different from altruism. And the central problem in Christian theology is how to understand the relationship between these two principles, the infinite and the primacy of love. Because you could say, it is in love that we are able to imagine one another and accept one another as context transcending individuals who are not exhausted by their roles. But we are not yet these individuals. We have to make ourselves into them in history.
So would you say that, how do you see friendship, which was an important religious, spiritual concept from antiquity into the 19th century in relation to love? And friendship is generally, according to a lot of scholarship, was seen as equality was a central theme. The two friends were equal, and
So friendship has something of the characteristic of love.
And
right?
is love, are you defining love in terms of equality?
So of course, love at some level requires equality.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
And the love, of course, cannot flourish among strangers.
Right.
Although we are commanded to love the stranger,
Right.
we don't know how to do that.
Right.
So then the question is, what plays the role of love in relations among strangers. And in the evolution of Western thought, the idea was it's cooperation among free and equal individuals, which is the surrogate for love among strangers. But then, of course, there's a contest over the institutional form of this cooperation, and that's the substance of the struggles of politics. The political institutional forms and the economic institutional forms. But back then to my argument. So there's this idea of the individual as a sharer in divinity. And the message of the American prophets then, on this account, is that ordinary men and women can be raised up to lives with a higher level of intensity, of scope, and of capability. They can become more divine. And on this view, we become more human by becoming more godlike in the sense of sharers in the attribute of transcendence, not in the attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. And this idea, you could say, is the theological basis of democracy. That we are sharers in this transcendence, and the central creed of democracy then on this view is faith in the creative and prophetic powers of ordinary men and women. So these powers of spirit, rather than being concentrated in a spiritual elite, are widely diffused within humanity. And they have to be organized and recognized. I'm saying this then is the message of the American prophets. Now, what then is the problem?
Right. So far, that's Douglas. That's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That's
Okay.
that fits their religious and cultural vision beautifully.
So now then the question is, where is the taint? Where is the defect in this prophetic message, or at least in some of its conventional interpretations? Because of course the message can be interpreted in many ways. It can take many expressions. So the first I want to argue is a disturbance in the understanding of the relation between self-construction, self-fashioning, and connection, and human connection. This individual in the image of God is isolated. He can become stronger, and then on the basis of his strength, associate with others, seek the company of other people, cooperative organizations, philanthropy, generosity. From the very beginning, one of the characteristics of American life was the vitality of philanthropic initiative. But the philanthropic initiative, at least on some visions of this self-fashioning, came later, as it were. In other words, the individual in the first instance is a little Napoleon who crowns himself, because after all, he's in the image of God, he shares in the image of God. And then, having crowned himself, having ascended to this imperial state, he then is philanthropic. He cooperates.
That's where we part ways, because I don't see Douglas or Stanton or Lincoln or Emerson or Whitman seeing themselves as Napoleons.
I'm exaggerating, but I'm taking one side of it. So, what is the problem here? It is a failure to understand the contested character of self-construction. Let me state the idea first, and then we'll discuss it. So, one of the ways in which we are free is resolving the following problem. To be free, we have to connect. because no one is free alone, and isolation is not freedom. Freedom is empowerment, and that requires connection.
Thoreau might.
Practical, emotional, cognitive connection.
Thoreau,
But-
Thoreau might disagree with that. Although he sees plants and animals as equal to humans.
But every connection threatens us with some form of subjugation or loss of personal distinction. So there is a contradiction in this requirement, in this presupposition of self-assertion. We have to connect to be free, but every connection is a threat. Emerson says, imitation is suicide, but social life is to a great extent mimetic. That's the nature of human desire. We desire what others desire. So, what then is the first definition of freedom? The first definition of freedom is that we find ways to connect without being subjugated. That we can diminish the price of loss of personal distinction or autonomy, that we must pay for connection. And that then launches us on an exploration of the alternative ways of organizing social life. Now, so this is the first complaint or critique of this message. Does it adequately acknowledge this first contradiction in the requirements of self-construction? Yes, now you were going to say something.
Yes, I wanted to ask you how you reconcile the idea of philanthropic and generosity, which sounds a lot like altruism, with what you said beforehand of love and cooperation. And then also, if you could elaborate on cooperation, because for me, when you cooperate is that you see you're standing on equal ground. You can see how both of you working together leads to a shared end. Whereas, as we're talking about slavery, it sounds very much more of an appeal through compassion to remind people of humanity to change and find that common ground.
Cooperation among free and equal individuals is, I suggested, the equivalent of love in life among strangers. So I'm not taking it as an alternative. I'm saying that is the direction. But the question is whether this idea of transcendence, of self-construction, adequately acknowledges this first contradiction in the nature of self-fashioning. I'm saying that on many of its conventional formulations, the formulations that Tocqueville described as American individualism, it doesn't. Because it says first the individual builds himself. Then he's generous. He's generous because he's strong. But the reality is that connection is internal to self-construction. It's not something that comes afterwards. And there's this contradiction which we have to solve. How can we build ourselves without connecting? It's not that connection comes afterwards. Connection comes before. So this is the first issue. Now, the second issue, the second contest or critique of this prophetic message has to do with its relation to the institutional structure of society. And therefore, my second accusation or complaint against the prophetic message is that it is susceptible to the sin of institutional idolatry. And for the Americans, the early Americans, but also the Americans much later, the characteristic form of institutional idolatry was to suppose that there is a natural form of a free society. And that they know what it was, that they discovered it. They may have failed to implement it, for example, with slavery in the South, or in the oppression of the Indians, but they knew what it was. And the idea was that the American Republic, early in its history, discovered the formula of a free society. And it had only to be adjusted from time to time under the provocation of crisis. But it was expressed politically in the constitutional arrangements of the United States, thus the cult of the Constitution, and economically in the market order. So the free market economy was the economic expression of the natural form of a free society. Yes?
Going back to, I guess, this idea of democracy and freedom, particularly being...
Could you speak louder?
Sure. Going back to this idea of freedom as being based in connection,
Yes.
can we revisit perhaps what the qualifications for even being an American prophet is? As we talked about, not only with the abolitionist movement, but with the suffragette movement, Stanton, for example, in her rebuttal of the 15th Amendment, evoked many archetypes of Black men that, at the very least, would look at democracy as a zero-sum game, and also completely, I guess, illustrated which woman she was talking about for enfranchisement and completely...
Well, but this is a different order of questions, because one question is who participates or who has access to this system of political freedom. But the second question is, what is the system of political freedom to which they have access? Because in the Constitution, the Americans organized a kind of proto-democratic liberalism. In the initial form, there were a whole set of constraints. It wasn't just women who were excluded. There were property qualifications to the suffrage, and therefore also educational qualifications to the suffrage. And many counter-majoritarian vestiges remain in the American Constitution. So, for example, a central organizing principle of the American constitutional arrangements is the relation that is established there in the American Constitution between the liberal principle of fragmentation of power and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, as in Madison's system of checks and balances. So power is fragmented, it's divided up, there are many sources of power in the state, and the system is designed to slow politics down. So there's a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that it has to overcome in order to be implemented. That's what I'm calling the slowing down of politics.
And it's consistent with the susceptibility to the sin of institutional ideology. That the two go hand in hand. If institutions...
Idolatry. Yes. So
Idolatry.
the Americans think a dominant tenet of American constitutional theory is that these two principles that I've just described, the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, go together naturally and necessarily. But they don't go together naturally and necessarily. They go together only by intention and design. The constitutional arrangements were designed to slow politics down. On the assumption that there's a natural system of social and economic freedom, and you didn't want it to be disturbed constantly by political attacks of the majority. So the complaint of institutional idolatry is the idea that the premise of this system of freedom, the individual, self-fashioned, the little Napoleon, who on the basis of his power can then be generous, is that he lives in a society which attempts to approximate the natural form of freedom, politically and economically. And I want to say this is a superstition. And there is no such natural form of freedom. So in order to explain this idea a little more, let me relate it to the criticism of a central conception in liberal political theory, which is related to this idea of the Americans. So the central conception is that there is a regime of right, which is neutral. Or to state the same idea in different terms, there's a distinction between the right and the good. The good is impersonal and neutral. The right is sectarian. The right is impersonal and neutral. The goods are sectarian and contentious. So we have different visions of the good, but we all live under the same impersonal order of right. Neutral principles, economic and political, within which we pursue our different visions of the good.
Can you give us an example of a right?
An impersonal order of right, like the market order, or like a vision of democracy, which is not supposed to depend on any sectarian conception of the good. It's supposed to be neutral. What I want to say, by way of criticism of this idea, is that there is no institutional order that is neutral. Because every institutional order tilts the scales, encouraging some forms of experience and discouraging others. And so this is a false idea. And the idea of neutrality, of these neutral economic or political principles, is in the end always adduced in support of its opposite, which is the entrenchment of a particular system against attack. And it is then defined as neutral. So it's the opposite. So the claim of neutrality is what prevents the attack on what is inevitably always a sectarian order. Nevertheless, the false idea of neutrality has a kinship to another idea, which is not superstitious, is valid and even indispensable. The kinship is that to a system which is open to a wide range of contradictory experience and is corrigible. So what matters is that you be able to correct the institutional system in the light of experience. It's open to attack. So the valid ideas of contradiction and corrigibility are the alternative to the false idea of neutrality. Now, it's this false idea of neutrality that underpins the conception that a free society has a natural and necessary form, politically and economically. There is no such thing, I want to argue. This is then becomes part of the argument about institutional idolatry as the second complaint. So in the light of that critique of liberal political ideas, let me now describe a second form of contradiction in the presuppositions of self-fashioning. Just 1 minute. To be free, we must engage in a particular form of social life, because no one is free unless he engages. But every engagement in a particular social world seems to threaten us with the need to surrender to it. So we are not free if there's a contradiction between the need to engage and the need to avoid surrender. So we would have to be able to find a way to engage without surrendering. So the individual has to somehow be lifted up, made more capable, so that he can participate without surrendering. And the institutions, economic or political, have to be rendered open to contradiction and correction, so that in engaging with them, we can continue to attack them. In other words, we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. So that's a higher idea of freedom. So the argument that I'm beginning to mount is the argument that this idea of freedom has to be revised in the light of these two complaints. The idea of cooperation as being internal to self-construction rather than just external, and the idea of every institutional arrangement as being, to use the theological language, dust in the eyes of God. There's no sacrosanct, natural, and necessary form of a free society. And we achieve greater degrees of freedom by constantly attacking, subverting, reinventing the institutional arrangements, including the institutional arrangements of a free society. Yes?
Clarifying question. So if I'm understanding correctly, the institution is quote unquote neutral because it is reactionary, it's not provocative, it doesn't provoke things. So the attacks come from political changes, political crisis, whatever it may be, and then because it is reactionary to that change that is facing, therefore it takes a neutral tone. And then you use the language later about surrendering to the institution. My understanding, if that is a correct grasp of the institution itself, the citizen or the private...
No, the claim is that there are no neutral institutions. Neutrality is an illusion, a will of the wisp.
So it takes on that claim as it faces change. So you have a system, a status quo, and then if a political movement comes about to inspire some change or ask it, then that takes on a tone.
No, but to come back to the American discussion now, so we don't get lost in these categories. The question is whether the form of freedom, of political and economic freedom, developed in the United States was a once and for all invention. The Americans somehow early on in the life of their republic discovered the natural and necessary form of a free society. That's the question. And they couldn't have, because that's not the nature of institutions. All institutions are flawed, fallible, corrigible. What we can ask of them is that they be open to contradiction and that we be able to change them in the light of experience. We cannot ask of them that they be neutral. That's the argument. And if we ask of them that they be neutral, then we become imprisoned by them. So we're going to discuss later in the course these dynamics in the early history of the Republic. There's a developmental ideology on top of nation building, the opening of the country, Hamilton's project, a project of national development. And there was a selective democratization of the country in the then two crucial sectors of agriculture and finance. The creation of family scale farming with entrepreneurial attributes through what in a contemporary vocabulary we would describe as decentralized strategic partnership between government and the family farmer and cooperative competition among the family farmers. That was the creation of a different kind of agricultural market had never existed in the world before. And so the country was formed by this interaction between the nation building at the top and the selective democratization below. Of course, against the background of the reality of African slavery. Now, the underlying principle of this initiative was that a market economy has no natural form. And and the proof is that the Americans invented a kind of agricultural market that had never existed before. They did a similar thing in finance. But they never generalized or made explicit the underlying idea that a free society has no natural form. And the actual politics which they established in their constitution, and which I have just labeled a proto-democratic liberalism, was not designed to exploit the larger possibilities of this invention of theirs at the outset. So all of this is in the service of the idea that it's not good enough to complain that the message of the American prophets hasn't been enacted. The complaint of hypocrisy, of failure of implementation. There is a problem also in the message itself. And so the enactment of the message of the American prophets has to come together with the critique and revision of the message. That was the point of this argument.
But a number of the American prophets did revise their message. Most notably Douglass, but also Katie Stanton in different ways. Also, you mentioned Emerson and Whitman in different ways.
But let's go back then to this question, which was raised at the back of the class then.
Right.
So the common way in which this kind of problem is presented in the United States is someone is being excluded, right, like blacks or women or someone. And so there's a failure of equal access. But here I'm emphasizing something else. What is the nature of the system to which they're having this equal access? So I would say the Americans, all the democracies that exist in the world are relatively weak democracies. Right. They're based on a low level of political engagement by the people. That's the first defect. So they're all based on, so the premise is politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. So it's either a politics of a deliberative, rational politics, technocracy, notables, and so forth, or it's Caesarism, populism, and so forth.
But in the 19th century, it was very different. Well over 90% of eligible voters voted in the 1830s through up until the Civil War. It's a huge, more than any other country.
But they never accepted. They never made it mandatory to vote, as many countries in the world have.
They make it mandatory, but the fact that.
But they did vote in the majority.
Yeah, by far, in a huge majority. Radically different from today.
Sure. But
95%.
This is the role. This is, of course, the role of institutions,
right,
which is
right.
Collective sentiments come and go. They're like the waves of the sea, but the institutions transform an ephemeral collective habit into a regular, enduring practice. Huh? So one of the characteristics of a high-energy democracy would be to raise the level of organized popular engagement in political life. For example, by the rules governing the relations between politics and money, politics and media, the electoral regimes, the rules of mandatory voting, and so forth. The second sphere of institutional innovation would be the setup of the government. You could say, we will retain the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but we will reject the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. So that's not a mystery. It's relatively easy to do that. For example, you could have a constitutional architecture that said, if there is an impasse between the two political branches, either political branch on its own initiative can break the impasse by calling early elections. But the elections will always be bilateral for both branches. So the branch that exercises the constitutional prerogative of calling the early elections has to run the electoral risk and pay, therefore, the price of running the risk. So by that simple institutional innovation, you would transform the regime into a regime for the acceleration of politics. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about ask about the second principle about the institutional idolatry. I mean, even taking that example, you could argue, I feel like as you have, that the reason why we don't see that sort of institutional change is because we've constructed this mythical narrative of our institutions being neutral. But I guess I would push back, even using some of the readings where it's like, I wouldn't say that is the reason. I guess my understanding is that I think the reason why these institutions have stayed in place and endured over time is because we don't just say that they're neutral. There's actually a huge normative moral weight that we say, this thing that even Frederick Douglass is saying, America didn't really get the principles wrong. We love your principles. This is the way that, and basically everyone is in agreement saying, we don't just think this is a neutral way to set up society. We think there is one way to do it. It aligns with these principles. Like you see this in the Katie Stanton text.
You mean because it will be approved by its consequences, by its results?
No. I think they even start before that. I said before they even get to the consequences of the results, they're saying, and yes, they use they use theology to justify it, but they're using God as a way to say, this is the natural blueprint for dignified human life, whether it's...
And where does this idea of the natural come from?
Well, it's coming from the idea of theology, but my question there is saying that naturalness, they're not saying it in an objective sense, they're saying it in a normative sense. Like, we're not just saying this is just the blueprint, we're saying we approve of this blueprint, and that's why it should be done. So I guess I'm not sure if the question is clear, but it's, do you see the permanence or they're not really permanent, but do you see the resistance to institutional change fundamentally as a neutral?
No, but here we have a problem, because this is a contradiction in the ideology, right? I mean, it would certainly be possible to say, we want this proto-democratic liberalism because it favors a certain kind of hierarchical society. It's the kind of society we want, in which there aren't periodic popular disturbances, there aren't attacks on the established ways of doing things. But that was not the predominant way of explaining things in the United States, except in the South, right? Which did have this hierarchical ideology. So I'm not suggesting that the idea of neutrality is, that the falsehood of the idea of neutrality is somehow an explanation of what happened in the United States. What I'm trying to unpack is the architecture of this early American ideology, and to point to what exactly is problematic about it. And I think one thing that's problematic about it is the way in which it conceives of the relation between the self-construction of the individual and social solidarity. The individual is constructed through social solidarity, and that leads to a whole different way of thinking. And the second thing that is problematic about it is its assumptions about the institutional structure of social life. That it says, the form of a free society, we know what it basically is. And we presuppose that the market economy has an intrinsic and immanent form, and that democracy has an imminent form. But it doesn't have an imminent form. And we therefore need to organize our economic and political life so that one of the attributes of the political and economic institutions is that they invite their own revision and that they create opportunities for their own substitution. Now, that was not part of this ideology, and so that's the argument that we're having.
Shows you what you mentioned, the relationship between engagement and surrender.
Yes.
And
So I would say, just to broaden then the discussion of the formation of a self.
yes.
So let's say a central idea, a central part of the American idea of freedom is this idea of the strong self,
Yeah.
which is in the image of God, in fact, as suggested, an expression, an emanation of divinity. Now, I'm arguing that in many different dimensions, the presuppositions of this strong self are contradictory. And so one contradiction I mentioned, we have to be able to cooperate, but to diminish the price of subjugation which every cooperative regime imposes. The second contradiction has to do with the institutional background. We have to be able to participate, but we have to be able to participate without surrendering, so that we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. We can participate without allowing the institutional framework to have the final word. We have to be able to keep the final word for ourselves. Now, there's a third contradiction. To be a capable agent, the self has to form a way of being in the world. And the way of being is what the ancient Greeks called a character. It's the routinized formulaic form of the self. But the routinized formulaic form of the self is also a threat to freedom. It will suck the life out of us, because it then becomes the mask, the icon to which we give our life. So we have to have a coherent self, but we also have to be able to disrupt that coherent self in order to live. Because our aim, now then to promote this strong idea of selfhood, is to die only once. Not to die in installments, no? By repetition, by routines, and so forth. So we can ask, in what kind of society and in what kind of culture do we have the best chance of disrupting our characters? Because that's one of the dimensions of freedom. So the result of this argument is to reach toward a more complicated idea of freedom, which takes into account these contradictions. And the argument against the methods of the American prophets is that they fail adequately to do that. And they present the Americans with a formulaic idea of freedom, which is dangerous. The idea has to be attacked and revised, and not simply implemented.
Although I see that tension of engagement versus surrender as an effective activist, like a Douglass, like a Katie Stanton in 1848, like Lincoln, in which the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened all the northern territories to slavery, lifted him off his feet. I mean, he runs against Stephen Douglas. He runs as an activist Republican,
Yes.
knowing that you might fail. You might, your vision is especially.
Absolutely. So this introduces another problem, which is the relation between historical and biographical time. So we could say, we want to design the arrangements of society so that they allow us to moderate these three contradictions I've just described.
Right.
The relation of self to others, the relation of the self to the context, to the social world, and the relation of the self to itself. But these are collective projects, the transformation of politics. We want to replace this proto-democratic liberalism, this low-energy democracy, by a high-energy democracy, and so forth. So those projects succeed or fail in historical time. But we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. St. Augustine says all ages are equidistant from eternity. But we don't get to choose our place in history. So to the extent that the arrangements, the institutions of society do not solve these problems for us, how do we solve them for ourselves in the way in which we live?
But don't you think you can rely on historical actors as inspirations for addressing the present?
So I think that when you were referring to those people, you were describing their initiatives as activists, as prophets, as resistors, and
yes.
you're saying they were exemplary, they were giving an example of how even when the institutions of society fail to solve these problems, the individual can, in a sense, solve them by the way in which he lives.
Yes, and or speaks and acts.
So then the task of ethics on this view becomes to make up for the failures of politics. And so this is another part of the discussion. And so what is the moral ideal that the Americans had of action given the defects of their social arrangements? And that would be another level of the discussion. It would be all part of the discussion. But this is what I want to open up. That is, so I think the clear, I don't know whether we disagree about this or not. But the division is this: whether the problem is simply that there's this promise that the American prophets made, and it hasn't been realized adequately. And the typical way in which it hasn't been realized is that the different groups in society, the different races, for example, or the different genders, haven't benefited equally from that promise. So that's a familiar line. That is the most familiar line of argument in the United States. But now I'm opening up another kind of argument. I'm saying the problem is not in the equal access to this promise. The problem is in the promise itself. It's promising the wrong thing. It's in the content of the prophetic message that the problem lies. And that's a different kind of discussion.
Right, so go on, elaborate. If it's the message is the wrong thing, the content is the wrong thing, what is the right thing?
So that would then require me to embark on the third stage of the argument, which is to imagine what then would be an example of the reorganization of society that would go in this direction. That would still be incomplete because we'd still have the ethical question. What vision of the way of living would allow us as individuals in biographical time to follow this view to the extent that it's not followed in politics? So, and on the broadest terms, I would say, we would need a project that would have at least these four parts. So it would have to first involve the democratization of the market economy. The market economy has no natural and necessary form. There is no natural system of property and contract rights that embodies economic freedom. So we would have to imagine that different property and contract regimes, in other words, different versions of the market, coexist experimentally in the same market order. One of those versions would be the traditional property right, but it would be just one of them. The traditional property right has a big advantage. The big advantage is that it allows someone to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in. But it has a disadvantage because it doesn't make it possible to reconcile a wide decentralization of economic initiative with aggregation of resources at scale. So we would have to have a market economy that was democratized. And the test of democratization was to allow a much wider range of economic agents to have access to productive resources and opportunities, and especially access to the most advanced form of production. The most advanced form of production is now the knowledge economy, and the knowledge economy exists only in insular form. It exists in every sector of the production system, but in each sector only as a fringe which excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. Then we would have to replace these weak democracies by a strong democracy. Now, what is a strong democracy? It's a democracy that raises the temperature, the level of organized political engagement in political life. It's a democracy that accelerates the pace of politics, even as it raises its temperature, by resolving impasse quickly through the engagement of the general electorate, and that re-energizes the relation between the center and the periphery, the federal system. So the states or the parts of the country would have to become, in fact, what they're supposed to be, which are these laboratories of experimentation. So the society goes down a certain road, but as it goes down a certain road, under certain conditions designed to prevent abuse, it allows parts of itself to secede from the dominant solutions and to create countermodels of the national future. So that's democratic experimentalism, a high-energy democracy, to replace this proto-democratic liberalism. Then social cohesion would have to be founded on the multiplication of forms of collective action. It's not just cooperation among similar people, but it's joint collective action by the different. So that's the only effective basis of social cohesion, people doing things together. And doing things together in education, in the provision of public services, in military service, in social service. Everyone exempted from military service becomes subject to mandatory social service and so forth. And then in education, the formation of the individual. So what should education be like? So in a country that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States or Brazil, the principle has to be that the management of the schools by the municipalities and the states has to be reconciled with national standards of investment in quality. So the school system obviously can't depend on local finance. There has to be redistribution within the federation. But on this basis, there has to be a paradigm of teaching and learning, a model of teaching and learning, with the following characteristics to imagine this empowered agent. So the focus of education has to be on the analytic and synthetic powers of the mind, not on the mastery of dead content. Now, these capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content, but only in dealing with content. But with respect to content, what matters is not encyclopedic scope, but selective depth. So education should be thematic or project-oriented in order to provide the depth that can serve then as the basis for the acquisition of these imaginative powers of analysis and synthesis. The social setting of the school should be cooperation among teachers and students, among schools, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, which is what characterizes the traditional school system. And now comes the most important attribute of the educational system. It must be dialectical. No subject should be taught just once. Every subject should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view, because this is the only way to liberate the mind. The university culture is based on the forced marriage of methods to subject matters, fundamental physics is taught by an anti-historical method, but evolutionary biology is taught by a historical method. But even though we discovered in the 1920s that the universe has a history, so every part of nature is historical. So if we teach the young by in this dialectical fashion, we immunize them against the intellectual servility of the university culture. And then we deliver them to the higher stages of education, immunized against this acceptance of the servile dogmas of the university. So this then is the form of education appropriate to a democracy, a form of education that would recognize in every young person a tongue-tied prophet. Now I've given in the most schematic possible form a sense of the institutional direction of a project intended to recognize the implications of this critique of the message of the American prophets. And then, so if there is such a discussion in the country, it is in a sense a religion, it's a theological discussion, it's a discussion about the spirit. It's not just a discussion about practical details. And politics, when it is serious, is necessarily always also religious. So Tocqueville says this actually in his other book about the Ancien Regime. He says every great revolution is both a political revolution and a religious revolution, meaning it's both about institutions and it's about consciousness.
I'm glad that you bridged together politics with religion, because something that's also lingering right now for me is, like you said, that the problem lies in the promise itself. So for me, it's really difficult to envision political change without a leader that inspires or engages in moral imagination. So how does that work with also rising the heat? Or
without a leader or without a message? Because there can be many leaders, right?
But then how does that go hand in hand with part of the solutions being having a more active political force if the problem...
Well, this goes back to one of those contradictions. And so I think one of the fundamental principles of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that politics must either, as I said, be institutional and cold, or it must be hot and anti-institutional. Meaning, in practice, to translate this, at the end of the day, you must choose between Madison and Mussolini. Now, I think this is false, because politics, one of the ways in which political arrangements differ from one another is they differ in the extent of their, what I call their temperature, the degree of organized, sustained political mobilization. You can have political arrangements that elevate the level of organized political engagement in political life. So it's not a mystery. It's the cumulative effect of many particular initiatives. So for example, if I give you in the United States today, with a supposedly depoliticized population, I say, you can't sell television time. It will be distributed for free to the political parties and the organized social movements. Political campaigns will be financed publicly. The vote will be mandatory, and so forth. The combined effect of these initiatives will be to raise the temperature. And what is regarded as cultural is in fact the product of many past acts of statecraft. So it's like saying the Japanese are solidaristic. They behave in the there's a life employment system, subordination, industrial peace. In the 1930s and 40s, Japanese industrial relations were among the most conflictual and violent in the world. So what is commonly mistaken to be cultural is in fact the result of a political construction. And we can imagine then the transformation of the spirit of the country by this idea.
So do you think that can happen with the existing two-party system?
Not in its current form, but I think the mistake in thinking about the reformation of society is to imagine it as a kind of system. So if you approach it as a system, then nothing can change unless everything changes, and everything changes at the same time. So that idea leads to a false conception, which is a binary view of politics, in which you either have systemic change, which is the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, or you have reformism, which is the management of the current system. And so in this way, what has happened in the world is that the idea of revolution, the Marxist idea, has been converted into an alibi for its opposite. So the institutionally conservative social democrat who governs today many countries in the world, an ex-Marxist, thinks real change would be revolutionary change, the total substitution of the system. Now that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do is to humanize the world through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. And so then the progressive becomes the humanizer of the inevitable. You ask, what is his program? His program is the program of his conservative adversary with a humanizing discount. So that's then what we get. So what we have to think is that real change is structural change, always involving both institutions and consciousness. And when it happens always in a fragmentary and piecemeal form. That's how it really happens. The idea of total substitution is a limiting case, a fantasy. And so radical reform is partial structural change, which can nevertheless become revolutionary if it persists in a certain direction. And I think that in a sense, that idea at least, is close to what the Americans in the early 19th century practiced, even if they didn't believe it. That is, many of these people were doing exactly that. They were engaged in this practice of radical reform involving both institutions and consciousness.
And there was a dialectical...
A dialectical relation between them, exactly. Now, in the thought experiment that I gave just now of this direction, I was, of course, speaking very remotely and very schematically in these terms. But that's not what we do in the practice and language of transformation. The language of transformative practice is always simultaneously practical and prophetic. So the political prophet has to give an image of the direction, but he has to foreshadow, he has to touch the wound, because we're all like Thomas. We have to touch the wound to believe. And so he has to give a down payment, an installment on this future that he promises, something that's visible and tangible now. And that's also what they did in the 19th century.
Yes, that's very good.
So I think we've run out of time.
We have. Great ending.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not gonna lie.
Institutional transfer.
I was playing against him, and he was spitting like 10 minutes. I completely thrown out of the game, and I checked myself. No, you're good. Yeah. Oh, English?
I was like, how can I solve it? I was like, oh yeah. I thought she called for like 3 moves. I was like, still more.
He's like, that was not a solution. So that's. I honestly. He's the that's my separate bit.
So he just
That was part of the.
He's like, I'm gonna talk about what I want.
Yeah, I've heard that twice.
And this is the first time.
Okay.
Exactly. That's like, I don't know if I
Did you know it was?